Gun ownership, a data-driven overview. Americans own guns at a scale unmatched anywhere else. Surveys find about one-third of U.S. adults personally own a firearm, and roughly 40% of adults live in a home with a gun. Independent estimates put the total number of civilian firearms in the U.S. at roughly 393 million, more guns than people. In fact, Americans, about 4% of world population, possess about 46% of all civilian-owned guns globally. This works out to roughly 120 guns for every 100 U.S. residents. For context, most other countries have far lower ownership rates. These figures set the stage. A large stock of privately owned guns, distributed across a sizable share of households, underpins the U.S. situation. Who owns guns? Demographic breakdown. Gun ownership rates vary sharply by group. For example, political affiliation is a strong factor. About 45% of Republicans and Republican leaners say they personally own a gun, versus only about 20% of Democrats. Gender also matters. Roughly 40% of men report owning a gun compared to 25% of women. Living area is another factor. People in rural areas report much higher ownership, 47%, than those in suburbs, 30%, 20%. By race ethnicity, roughly 38% of white Americans own guns, versus about 24% of black Americans and 20% of Hispanic Americans. Republicans leans 45% own guns. Democrats leans 20%. Men 40% versus women 25%. Rural 47%. Suburban 30%. Urban 20%. These patterns reflect cultural and regional differences. For instance, gun ownership is much more common in the South and Midwest than in the Northeast or on the coasts. For example, Gallup data circa 2018 showed 42% of U.S. direct households had a gun, concentrated in a minority of households owning many guns. Overall, men, Republicans, and rural residents are most likely to be gun owners, while women, Democrats, and city dwellers are least likely. Historical trends in ownership. Gun ownership in the U.S. has been relatively stable in recent decades, but it has shifted over the longer term. In the mid-20th century, roughly half of American households owned guns. That share declined through the 1990s. Since the early 2000s, ownership has bounced back. Surveys from 2017, 2021, and 2023 all find about 30 to 32% of adults personally owning a gun, indicating little change in the last few years. Gallup has similarly tracked about 30 to 32% of adults owning guns since 2007. However, underlying sales in the total gun stock have grown. One study found U.S. civilians acquired at least 122 million new or imported firearms from 2006 through 2017. This surge in gun buying, often linked to political and social events, has left Americans with a huge gun stock, about 120 guns per 100 people by 2017. Recent FBI data reflect a 2020-21 spike in sales. Background check counts, a proxy for gun purchases, jumped to record highs during the pandemic and then fell in 22 to 2023. In short, after a boom in the 2010s, rates of ownership have steadied, but the absolute number of guns in circulation continues to grow. Gun laws, federal versus state, gun regulations in the U.S. are a mix of federal rules applying nationwide and state laws varying by jurisdiction. Federally, individuals prohibited from owning guns, e.g. felons, most domestic abusers, are banned from purchasing firearms. The 1993 Brady Act requires licensed dealers to run FBI background checks on buyers, but this covers only dealers. Private sales between individuals are not federally mandated to be checked, the so-called gun show loophole. Federal law also bans fully automatic weapons, short-barreled rifle shotguns, and certain accessories, and sets minimum age limits, 18 for rifle shotguns, 21 for handguns. States fill in many details, and laws vary widely. For example, background checks. Federal law does not require checks on private sales, but as of 2023, at least 20 states have passed universal background check laws extending checks to most private transfers. Purchase permits or waiting periods. Some states like California, Connecticut, Hawaii, Illinois require permits or waiting periods for buying handguns or even all guns, while others have no such rules. Carrying. About half the states now allow permitless constitutional carry of handguns in public, while the rest require a permit for concealed and sometimes open carry. Red flag laws. Currently, around 19 states plus DC have extreme risk protection orders that let courts temporarily remove guns from individuals deemed dangerous. Other differences include bans on assault style rifles or large magazines in some states, training requirements in others, and whether states recognize each other's carry permits. In summary, the federal baseline ensures certain categories of people can't buy guns and imposes background checks at licensed dealers. But state laws determine many day to day rules, permits, carry rights, specific bans. As a result, a person's ease of acquiring or carrying a gun can be very different depending on the state. Had societal impacts, safety and economics. The widespread prevalence of guns has significant public safety and economic consequences. Gun related injuries and deaths are a major issue. In 2022, there were over 48,000 U.S. deaths from gunshots, about 132 per day, and in 2023, that number was nearly 47,000. These are among the highest totals ever recorded. Suicides account for the majority of gun deaths. In 2023, about 27,300 Americans died by firearm suicide, roughly 58% of gun deaths. Homicides made up most of the rest, about 17,927 gun murders, 38% of gun deaths. The remaining few percent involve police shootings, accidents, or undetermined intent. In other words, roughly 8 in 10 U.S. murders involve a gun, and over half of U.S. suicides involve a firearm. Beyond fatalities, non-fatal injuries are far more numerous. Each year, tens of thousands of people survive gunshot wounds. One estimate is over 75,000 non-fatal firearm injuries treated annually. These survivors may face long-term disability and high medical bills. Overall, gun injuries affect all communities, but rates are much higher for certain groups. For example, young adult males and urban minorities see the highest homicide rates, while elderly white men have high suicide rates. The economic costs of gun violence are substantial. Medical treatment, law enforcement, and lost productivity all add up. For instance, one CDC analysis found that youth homicides, mostly shootings, cost the U.S. about $86 billion in 2020, of which $78 billion, 90%, was attributable to firearms. Other studies estimate even larger totals. A broad analysis placed the annual economic burden of gun violence at $557 billion, about 2.6% of U.S. GDP. That figure includes direct healthcare costs, mental health care, criminal justice, and the value of lives lost. To give perspective on the burden to taxpayers, the same study estimated roughly $12.6 billion per year in direct public costs, about $274,000 per gun death and $25,150 per non-fatal injury. These costs fall disproportionately on states with higher gun death rates, underlining that gun violence imposes a heavy toll on society and government budgets. International comparison. In global perspective, the U.S. is an outlier on gun ownership and gun violence. Americans own far more guns per person than citizens of any other country. Many other high-income nations have less than 10 guns per 100 people, whereas the U.S. has about 120 per 100. This translates into much higher rates of gun death. For example, a recent analysis found U.S. firearm homicide rates are 33 times those of Australia and 77 times those of Germany. An NPR report using 2021 data calculated the U.S. gun death rate at 4.31 per 100,000 people, more than 7 times Canada's rate, 0.57, and roughly 340 times Britain's, 0.013. In fact, among large high-income countries, the U.S. ranks first or second in firearm death rates. Put simply, most wealthy countries experience very low levels of gun violence compared to the U.S. Japan, the U.K., and South Korea have near zero gun deaths per capita. Australia and most of Western Europe are also well below U.S. levels. These differences mirror ownership. Countries with stricter laws and far fewer private guns have far fewer shootings. The U.S., by contrast, stands out both for having by far the most guns and much higher gun death rates. Conclusion. In summary, roughly one-third of Americans own guns, and the U.S. has by far the largest stock of civilian firearms in the world. Owners tend to be men, Republicans, and rural residents. Over the past 2 decades, gun sales surged, adding hundreds of millions of guns to circulation, and ownership rates have held steady at these high levels. The U.S. regulatory landscape is a complex patchwork. Federal law bans certain weapons and requires dealer checks, but many rules, purchase permits, carry rights, red flag laws, etc., are set by individual states. The result is wide variation in gun access across the country. These facts matter because of their consequences. Firearm injuries claim tens of thousands of lives every year in America, far above rates in peer nations, and impose huge economic and social costs. This data-driven overview is intended to clarify what the U.S. gun ownership situation looks like, the number of guns and owners, how that has changed, who owns them, and how this compares at home and abroad. It provides a neutral, fact-based foundation for understanding the debate around guns in America without drawing any policy conclusions. Sources: authoritative surveys and analyses from Pew Research, Gallup, the Small Arms Survey, CDC FBI data, and research institutions, see citations, are used throughout to report the latest figures and trends.